everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Stefan Bertram, and God is dead, and we have killed him. In important news, Ben is as late as he's ever been. This is not a lateness of just pure unknownness. Rather, Ben said he's going to be very late. Not very more late than now. He said he should be about now. But we were so late that I thought we should probably just begin. The problem was, I'd prepared things to say at the beginning, but they were all going off first asking Ben for an anecdote. Rip Ben, Ben's dead. Rip, 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 rip. I was going to ask Ben if he'd ever had a religious experience or a ghostly experience or some generally kind of spooky experience. And this is in relation, though, as I initially tell it, they won't seem to have any relation at all, with a conversation I had on Reddit Ask Philosophy, where in regards to ChatGPT and other large language models, boo, boo, ghost. In regards to large language models, I was basically suggesting that in order, if you want to understand these things, hello,
Hello.
hi, I've only just begun.
Okay, fair enough.
Ben, have you ever had a religious experience?
Depends on how you count it.
Like, I'm asking for anything here. Have you had a religious experience? Have you had like a ghost experience? Have you had anything like this?
Uh-huh. I was not expecting this
Maybe
today.
you did the international social salute because you're late.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, let's see. Ghosts, no. I definitely not. I actually remember a friend of mine once telling me that a house that her family owned was haunted, and I was like pressing her on like why exactly she thought so. And
The vibe was off, Ben.
yeah, exactly. And part of it was that there was like some light bulb that like that they have that it's like the light bulb kept like unscrewing itself,
Right.
and so I just kept thinking, okay, so maybe we could have like explanation number one is that we're fundamentally wrong about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. And death is not the end, et cetera, et cetera. The physical causation is not in a closed system. Option number two is loose socket.
But
Like,
the thing is, Ben, is that the ghost believer or the religious experience believer would say that this isn't the only datum, and in fact, there's these billions of datums that most people will tell you about. But was there a religious experience?
not really. I mean, I was thinking about it. Like, I mean, I could certainly during the part. I think in the conventional sense, no. I mean, I think that there's like there's definitely like times when, back when, I believed in God, when I can like remember particular moments where, I'd be like struck by something and I had like very strong religious feelings or whatever. But like in a real sense, no, not really.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people who's convinced that like if there really were ghosts, I still wouldn't see them, just because I'm just that strongly like not of that sort. Um,
Yeah. And I mean, like, okay, there's supposed to be all these other data points. But the problem, of course, is that these were all private data points, right? Like that. There's no. That's certainly like anybody who says that they've seen a ghost. This is it's all take my word for it stuff.
And people,
And
like, if you took four people into a ghostly house and they all said they saw a ghost, but then you took them and separated them and didn't let them confer, the things that they would say would be wildly different.
yeah, exactly. So it just doesn't seem like, it doesn't seem like right now, I mean, look, by all means, continue the investigations, do the, like, do the paranormal stuff where you go into the house with the what is it, like the black and white thing that shows you like the energy signatures or whatever. By all means,
the
let's
ghost,
let's
the
let's
ghost peers.
let's continue the important investigations of like creaky old houses and see what we come up with. But at present, I don't really think the evidence supports this.
But I wanted to ask that in the context. I mean, I was hoping you'd had one, but I also
Not, not,
it's good that you
not
didn't.
really.
So we're on the same level. Um, I want to tell this in the context of a Reddit story.
Okay,
I just began it as you came in,
sure.
um, where I was talking about large language models, and I was suggesting, I think very reasonably, that the best way to understand large language models is not through the user interface. The user interface will massively mislead you to how these things work internally. And what you should do is actually study how these things work internally. And there's some things that we don't know about that, like in some sense, like we don't quite know how some bits of the LLMs go, and that's kind of the appeal of them. That they, in some degree, they kind of escape what we directly program them to do, which is kind
Yeah.
of why they're better than other stuff. Um, but broadly, we understand what's going on with LLMs, or rather, some people that work on them do, but almost everyone who engages with them doesn't. And so, if you're part of this 99.99%, what you should do is try and engage with this material, which will tell
Yeah.
you the internal workings going on. And this got quite a negative reaction from some people who were basically desperate for it to be the case that we don't understand how LLMs work. And I think there's this incredibly strong natural human tendency towards mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
That they're like people. They're just really desperate to not like for it not to be understood how this thing works. Whatever new thing it is that comes along, people very much want them not to be understood. Um, and I think I'm genuinely going to be more sympathetic to in a certain way Peter Hitchens' position in this
Mm-hmm.
article, basically on the point that I think it's really hard to be an atheist. I think there's very few people out there who really are atheists, even if they don't believe in God, in the sense that they are actually a thoroughgoing metaphysical atheist who doesn't, at all points, turn towards trying to find some kind of mysticism or hidden, secret, mysterious blah blah. Of course, I arrogantly exclude myself from that own thing and think I am a proper atheist. Um,
Sure.
but
Sure.
I think it's hard for people.
Yeah. I'll give you a little bit of an echo. I don't know what's up with that, but yeah. To Waba Cohen in my chat, I would just say that um, every once in a while, like to do a stream about philosophy because philosophy is fun, and that's okay. The you know what, Karl Marx would have done YouTube philosophy streams if the technology had been available to
I
him.
mean,
Oh,
the problem with if the internet had been around where Marx was around, he would have got no work done, and we never would have got
yeah,
capital.
no, exactly. In fact, he would have done so many streams to like yell at people about interpreting Hegel wrong and things like that. That he never would have read Capital. So really, thank God there was no 19th century YouTube. But yeah, I think that this is uh you know we do mostly politics. Not everything has to be politics. Feel free not to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it's a
Uh,
philosophy show. If you're not interested in philosophy, fuck off.
the yeah, that's the it's funny. I was just thinking somehow that seems like the more British way to say it, which is funny because I also think of being like politely evasive as more British, but like I think that both. politely evasive and fuck off like
Well,
both.
if I was the proprietor of Give Them an Argument, I would say what you said. But in of the fact that I'm not the proprietor, I'll say the other thing.
Yeah, fair enough. In any case, yeah, no, so all right. So is it, I mean, being a proper atheist, I mean, look, if the question is just do you feel some sort of temptation towards like non-material explanations of things, um I mean, I do, right? I mean, we're all like weird, like hyper primed up pattern recognition bots, and it's not like, it's certainly not like I'm immune from that, right? That the sort of seeing patterns and things that aren't really there, thinking that like thinking that something was supposed to happen, whatever. Even though in the abstract, I think that's all very dumb, right? That's that's still, sure. I mean, I think that's things people are going to do. I mean, certainly, I think that it's very psychologically difficult to like really internalize the idea that you're going to die and that's that,
Right.
right? That, as I always think of Saul Bellows' novel Ravelstein. Guy says, nobody really believes the pictures stop, right? That, like, you're sort of trying to imagine stopping existing, and like nobody can really
Right.
do
Because
it.
I mean, I won't be there, will I?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we kind of try, we're so primed to imagine things in terms of our future perceptions of them, that we try to perceive, think that, like, oh, there's something we're perceiving. We're sort of thinking of like fading to blackness or something. It's like, no, there's just no, you're just not, you just don't have a perspective anymore. There is no you to have a perspective.
Yeah, you're not in the void. There just isn't a you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Now, I will say that I think that, as difficult as that is, both sort of, conceptually and emotionally, I do think that I'm pretty, like, in 2020 and 2021, I kind of had yeah, there were a couple of people who were really important to me who died in both cases very unexpectedly, and this all happened while there was a global pandemic going on, so I couldn't really like go out or talk to anybody. And so, I spent a while in a pretty bad place, and and I've always thought since then, it's like, oh, probably not gonna ever start believing in life after death, because if I was going to, this would have
It
definitely
would
been the
have been
time.
then.
Like, so, I don't think that's like do take a bow or anything. I think that's just like, for whatever reason, I think I've just got into a point in my life where I seem to be psychologically immunized from that. But yeah, so I think that there definitely are things about um, about sort of internalizing a kind of atheistic materialist worldview that are very difficult. You know, whether that whether that means that, like, we can't have a civilization, or we're just going to be a bit angsty about it, though, is a different question.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it is interesting. I was thinking because as soon as I mean, I sadly it turned out. I mean, and I guess it wasn't that surprising that the debate that the article that Ben wrote about this week
Yeah,
between the Hitchens brothers, Christopher and Peter, and he called one of
yeah.
them Stephen. I don't think it's a Stephen.
What's that?
And then he called one of them Stephen before remembering they're called Peter and
Oh
Christopher.
yeah, oh yeah. Who can forget
Um,
Stephen Hitchens? That's it would be like in the Hitchens household. Well, Christopher and Peter were both 12, and they were screaming at each other about God and Trotskyism. then Stephen was always just sitting there, trying to eat his breakfast cereal and not get involved.
Yeah, now he's a bank manager. Um,
Exactly.
but yeah, I mean, it was kind of a disappointment that the debate, at least the article wasn't very good. Yeah, it was shit this week, man. No, the debate between Peter
Yeah.
and Christopher just didn't seem very good. They didn't really seem to get at each other's points, and Peter seemed to basically just be saying things which were like self-contradictory, being like, if we stop believing in God, then Southampton will end up like it was in the 14th century, where everyone believed in God. Like it was just not very good.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think that really what this did, I mean, I should back up and say part of why this is interesting to me is obviously I wrote a book about Christopher Hitchens. And in that book, I wrote about both of his two previous big debates with Peter um, in 1999 and 2008. And I've done uh, Thursday night debate breakdowns on my channel a long time ago on both of those. Um, and this one was a new discovery for me. I didn't know it existed until pretty recently, partly because weirdly enough, it doesn't seem to be preserved on YouTube. Like I can't find a video of it anywhere, but there is a transcript that's available from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which was the hosting organization, and so certainly for me, this is like definitely my ears perked up when I found out that this existed, and in a certain sense, this is actually the topic. This is actually the religion topic you want these guys to debate, because in both of their cases, really, I think that one thing that neither of them really, showed much aptitude for, are really interested in, right, is actually arguing about the existence of God. Right. This is back in, last year, I don't know, spring or something last year. I did a couple of essays about the Hitchens William Lane Craig debate, which is the sort of most dramatic illustration of this fact as far as Christopher goes, that when he's actually arguing with a philosopher of religion who really knows his stuff, like William Lane Craig, it really comes out very quickly how kind of hopeless he is
yeah, that
about.
looking like destiny.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not. Have you seen all of that, by the way, in the
No,
last couple?
I haven't seen any of it. Like, why
No,
would I? Like,
not the 5 hour debate. I haven't watched that yet
oh, right.
either. I suppose I will subject myself to that sooner or later. But like right afterward, like right after the debate, people dug up. I believe Destiny himself dug up. But in any case, I think he was at least
The fact that Norman Finkelstein is really Jewish.
Yeah, like he was basically
They dug up the fact that he's a completely stereotypical New York Jew
yes, that they have
of a certain age,
that he's like a crotchety elderly Jewish man who
who writes written complaints about his neighbors because they're too loud.
Yes, which is I have to say I was singularly unshocked by not just because of his general persona, but also because like he's literally complained about his neighbors to me on stream before. But in any case, so this was being dug. So this was being dug up, and I posted. I admitted at the beginning of the tweet, right? It's like, look, I have not watched the debate yet. It's 5 hours, but if people are digging up personal dirt about Norm, that probably tells me that they don't have a good response to him on the substance of the point. And Destiny himself quote tweeted this angrily and said, oh, I see. So whatever happens, right? This is Like it's just going to confirm your worldview if
Right, but
Norm and
he basically seemed to confuse the point that Norman Finkelstein was making in the debate, which is you're a moron who doesn't know anything, you should stop talking. In other terms, kind of intellectual attacks, with what he was doing, which was presumably meant to not be an intellectual attack because that wouldn't make any sense, but presumably was meant to be a moral attack. And there obviously is a distinction there, with it being kind of irrelevant that Norman Finkelstein is an asshole if he is an asshole. While well, Destiny being a moron who doesn't know anything is very relevant when you're doing an intellectual debate.
yeah, I mean, if Norm is rude, then that's I mean, well, I don't know what to say about that. Then like Norm is
I
rude,
wouldn't.
but
It
like
would suck to be his neighbor, but I'm not.
sure, exactly. Doesn't really mean he's wrong about Palestine. And if uh
But
but
if Destiny is wrong about Palestine, it means he's wrong about Palestine.
yeah, exactly. And I believe, I mean, I didn't see everything that was going around, I'm sure, but I definitely saw a couple. But like I believe the sort of heart of Norm's barbs were that Destiny didn't seem to know very much about the topic. I mean, I think that was the crux of it. So, again, but like Destiny's tweet was like, oh, so if like Norm insults me, then it's epic, but like, and that shows that I'm wrong. And, and if and, and if I, dig up completely irrelevant personal dirt on Norm, then that shows that I'm wrong, so everything shows that I'm wrong, see, this is just like what happens when you go down an ideological rabbit hole. And, so I restricted myself to just like saying one further thing about this response, which is just, can you please point me to the places where I was like talking about how epic Norm's insults were? Because I really don't remember doing that, right? Like, or for that matter, ever using the word epic, um, as certainly as an adjective, in my life. But in any case, yeah, I am going to be curious. I don't know when I'm going to like find 5 hours to sit down and watch it, but I am kind of curious to do
I mean,
so.
you could just live stream the whole thing. That would
Yeah,
that would be that would be content as you did it. Hassan did that, but it took him 12 hours because he kept pausing.
yeah, yeah. I wonder with like minimal pause in how long that would take. That kind of feels like just find a day. That's the thing that I'm gonna do. Um,
But I think the Hitchens debate would be much more interesting. I
yes.
mean, the
Okay.
thing that's
Fair
really
enough. Yeah. So look, so neither of those guys, yeah, got distracted by this bizarreness. Um, so it's classic, epic. There you go. A word that I so often use. In any case, so neither of these guys, I think, really has much aptitude for actually arguing about the existence of God. If you read Christopher's book, God is Not Great, in that context, he does run through, some of the arguments for the existence of God, and he does say like reasonable things about what's wrong with some of them. If you have, I don't know, if you look at, I think his introduction to that Portable Atheist book, he does talk a little bit about the problem of evil there. I think certainly some of the readings he includes do, but really, most times I've seen him in debates where those things would have been relevant. He just forgets to bring them up because like this is just not material he's particularly comfortable with. And, he doesn't feel at home in it. It doesn't occur to him. And by contrast, I would similarly, right? Peter just doesn't bother really with any of that stuff. In fact, if anything, in cases where, I mean, in the debate he did in 2008 with Christopher, the half of the evening was spent arguing about Iraq and the other half about God. And he actually, Peter actually, since since the two of them didn't agree on anything, Peter actually got a rock right. Is that's maybe his best moment. But in the God part, as far as I can sort of infer what the implicit argument was, it's that we should take a leap of faith for the sake of, like, I don't know, public order or something, that that they have, that like that for essentially for the sake of civilization. And Christopher is really much more interested in making a utilitarian argument against, like, the consequences of religious belief, as well as sort of explaining why he thinks standard moral religious beliefs are morally abhorrent, than he is in actually arguing about whether they're true. So, I actually think that in a sense, it's like, yeah, can civilization survive without God? Yeah, this is the religion topic that I want to see these guys argue about, because this is actually the one that plays to what, both of them, I think, are really interested in. But that said, I think that even there, there's, I think that Peter was a bit inconsistent in ways that I think, to be fair, are not uncommon for people who take the kind of position that he takes. But I think he is a bit inconsistent in telling in interesting ways. And I think that really showing what was wrong with some of what he was saying would have required, actually going into the philosophy part, which is probably why Christopher didn't really do it. Right? That he's not, he wasn't great on that. So this is, and in some ways, I mean, really, like, this really is a really funny experience to me, at least, reading the transcript of this debate, because on the one hand, like, I've always really enjoyed, watching these guys. Like, obviously, I think that I have severe disagreements with both of them. Christopher, I think, was catastrophically wrong on most obviously Iraq, and a cluster of other issues in his last years. But like, that's kind of the big one. I in a line that I ended up having to delete for the sake of keeping this down to 3,000 words. I ended up deleting the whole
You
section.
kept the whole big thing about, and then I was drinking ouzo in Athens, mate.
Yeah. So yeah, like, in a part that I ended up getting rid of, I said that that I think that if I believed in an afterlife, I would think that Christopher is probably in purgatory right now, not for his religious beliefs. I think a just God would be willing to excuse those as a epistemically rational response to the evidence with which he was presented, through the glass darkly and all that. But basically for his stance on Iraq, right? This is so. I think that's really catastrophically wrong, but he was right about a lot of other things. Peter's right about that, but otherwise, I find the man's entire worldview just, bizarrely and almost charmingly alien to me. Right? I mean, it's like the sort of pleasure that you get from a certain kind of historical fiction, where you're being asked to identify with people in a completely different society with almost incomprehensible values. Peter Hitchens is, like, very worried about how dangerous marijuana is. He writes about that.
I was just listening to him because he went on Novara Media today, and I happened to see it just before, so I was like, I'll get myself hyped on Peter Hitchens. And I was listening to him talk about the Bush education system, and he was, I mean, I was completely sympathetic to what he was saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's also just very critical of, as far as I can tell, most things.
Yeah.
Like,
But he was just making the point that, he's for selective schools, as in
yeah,
schools which you have to take an exam to go to or whatever, or have certain whatevers. based on merit. And, I remember Stanley was like, well, does this not kind of determine how your life goes at 11? And he's like, well, it does, but our current system is our life is determined at 11 by how much money your parents have. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and how you do in exams is at least a bit better than that in terms of choosing for some kind of genuine merit and for helping children from poor families, as opposed to the current system where it's not nearly as bad as the US property system to education funding
Uh,
is in the US, but it's still obviously the fact that in the UK, in poor places, the schools are bad, and in rich places, the schools are good.
yeah, yeah, right. I mean, look, I don't know that much about how the system works there. I mean, I think that it's good if there are like I think it's good for there to be second and third chances built in, right? Like that, that's important. Um, but yeah, I mean, I certainly take the point about I mean, tests like this is something that
Because it's happening now, right, in the US, that they're getting rid of standardized testing to get into college. And that basically means or they're reducing how much it matters of all the things. And that basically means poor kids who don't know how to game the system, who don't have these other things, can't outcompete rich children who have all the extracurricular blah blah blah, know how to write these statements, blah blah blah.
totally, yeah. I mean, in fact, the advantages that you get from like SAT tutors on the test, like quantitatively, it doesn't actually seem to give you all that big a boost, right?
Mm.
Like this is whereas the advantage for having people like help you with your stupid fucking admissions essay where you talk about all the disadvantages that you overcome, you come up with some stuff to spin as disadvantages. The advantages that you get from having like lots of time to work on that and lots of people to help you and give you suggestions and all that stuff are really tremendous, right? I mean the people I mean the like look, I think that the people who the current system, insofar as there are a lot of colleges now that are de-emphasizing test scores and all that stuff, like and what matters are beyond grades or like admissions essays. I think that the people who that most benefits are people who have plausible claims to some sort of marginality, but also lots of money.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh, but yeah, no. So he's definitely not always wrong. He is also but he's very but yes, he's very curmudgeonly. He
He thinks the
tends to
Tory party are Euro communist.
yes, exactly. Yeah, and he was always writing about how Tony Blair and his associates were like nobody asked them enough about their their past as like radical Trotskyists in their youth, and stuff like that. It's really like yeah, there are some like pretty wild reactionary views there, and he's also just I think he is also just sort of instinctively critical of like most things. I don't think he feels any particular need to throw in his hat with a political project he thinks is going to succeed. I think he
I
just calls
mean, he declared the Conservative Party doomed 17 years ago. Hasn't voted for them since.
yeah, and like so that first debate with Christopher at the one at Conway Hall in 1999 was essentially about what would much later be called Brexit. And in bringing it up to him when he was a guest on my show, I sort of said that he was like, oh well, actually, I didn't, I didn't vote in the Brexit referendum. I didn't like either campaign. So it's like, all right,
I didn't vote either, so.
that's that sounds about right. Yeah, but like you also hadn't spent years advocating that Britain leave the European Union before the vote. So
It was actually in Athens when the vote happened.
yeah, yeah, fun city. Um, so yeah, um, this is and it actually will be interesting to see if Peter, who's still very much with us, takes any notice of the essay, because he did actually write a extremely long and involved response in his like Mail on Sunday blog thing to something I'd written about him about a year ago. So you never know. But in any case, uh, Peter, I think in this debate is alternating between a few different positions in ways that are common for people who have kind of a strong intuition that there's a really deep connection between God and morality, but don't necessarily spend enough time thinking about philosophy as such to sort of really clearly disambiguate like what they think that connection is. So during much of the debate, his position seems to be that if people stop believing in God, then they'll stop acting morally, or even if they don't, right, they'll stop educating their children to act morally, or even if they don't, because they're pansy intellectuals, then the other people they influence to stop believing in God, will stop acting morally. That seems to be his position for a lot of it, and I think most of what he says is only really coherent if you assume that that's what he thinks. But there are also definitely points where he's making a different claim, and in fact, sometimes he's even kind of giving up on the first claim to just focus on this one. But in that, the second claim would be, okay, well, maybe you can still be moral, but you just don't have like a coherent answer to where morality comes from, or you just end up being some kind of weird moral relativist or something like that, right? That he says that if without belief in God, there's no magnetic north, to define morality. And it's a little bit confusing though, because if you go with the first one, that no, just as like an empirical prediction, people who don't believe in God are going to start acting as if everything is permitted. Then you do have some obvious problems, right? One is that, well, look, there seem to be all these civilizations where, that are not only non-Christian, but, don't have anything like, monotheistic religious belief, right? Or maybe to the extent that there's some sort of religion, it just doesn't really revolve around gods in the same way. And yet, there are places, like Asia, most obviously, where historically, right before Christianity was brought there, and to a very great extent now, depending on the country we're talking about, where you have religions, right? But you don't, you certainly don't have anything like the idea that that there's a singular God who lays down commandments, and this grounds right and wrong, or anything like that, right? And you still,
And I mean now, right? China is, the only really committed state atheist state left in the world, and are renowned for having safe streets.
right. Yes, very true. Yes, I have in fact seen The Purge. I've actually, for better or worse, I won't claim they're all equally good, but I've seen every single Purge movie. I did a movie stream on that with KT Baldessaro, who actually had a bit part in one of them. She was the flag faced killer in the Purge election year. But yes, it doesn't. It seems that it seems that you can have very high, like very low degrees of religiosity in China, for example, without it being the purge every day. Um, and, he sort of, Peter says a couple of things in passing that make it sound like, well, okay, but there's this particular combination of order and liberty that we've had in like Anglo societies, and that maybe you need Christianity for. Um, but it's confusing because a quick glance at the relevant statistics will tell you that there are that there's like a higher percentage of the population that doesn't believe in God where you are than where I am. And there's a higher percentage of the population that doesn't believe in God in, say, Sweden than there is where you are. And yet, not only is it not the purge in Sweden, despite the fact that you could say, oh, China's authoritarian, whatever. It's like, yeah, Sweden's a pretty, Sweden's a pretty free country, right? It's I don't really know what the liberties are that are enjoyed by Brits that are enjoyed by Swedes.
It is true in Sweden, though, one of the very few weird countries where it's illegal to be high on drugs.
Interesting. All right.
But yeah, it's interesting. I was reading an article today about how
Can
terrible
you be
it is.
drunk? Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't
Okay.
know. Maybe drunk in public is illegal or whatever.
Okay.
Like some,
That's it.
that's a separate matter, right?
Yeah.
But intoxication can be illegal in Sweden when in other countries, in Britain certainly, if you're incredibly high on cocaine but don't have any cocaine, which is not inside of you,
Yeah.
then you're all right. As long as it's all inside, then you're fine.
Yeah. I
Um,
think even in the U.S., I mean, it's I think like there are laws about like public intoxication, but
yeah, but in Sweden, they can arrest you for being high on weed, like in your house. Obviously, it doesn't happen because how would that happen?
how would
But
they, right? But
it is.
theoretically, they could. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But
but
yeah,
yeah, I
no.
was reading an
In the
article.
U.S., I believe it is legal to be incredibly high in the privacy of your own home, even if you're in a state where the things that got you that way are illegal. But yeah, no, this is so. It still seems to be the case that in fact, not only is it not the purge in Sweden, right, but the homicide rate, for example, is lower there than it is in the UK, which is in turn lower than it is in the US. Um, from which I certainly wouldn't conclude that atheism, you know, leads people to commit fewer crimes, but just that
It
the two issues.
domesticates you.
Yeah. That the two issues seem to be largely unrelated. In fact, I mean, like one of the funniest things, as you already alluded to in Peter's presentation, was that he said that he was talking about the idea that that as sort of civilization declined, civilization declined, because people didn't believe in a source of ultimate authority, and there's no magnetic north and all of that. That things would eventually regress to like about the condition of the 13th or 14th century. When you didn't you didn't want to be out and out outside your home. When it was dark, and that's confusing because I mean, one thing I'm pretty sure of about the 13th or 14th century is there was very little atheism. There's actually, yeah, as far as I know, right? Uh, in fact, there's a really fun.
It's probably like almost impossible as an individual to be an atheist. Like it wouldn't occur to you, right? Like at the time, atheist was used as basically as to mean heterodox.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. So Alec Ryrie actually has a lecture for Gresham College that the YouTube algorithm recommended to me years ago, which is really interesting, called "How to Be an Atheist in in Medieval Europe," where he sort of goes through what evidence there is of of people who expressed, you know, atheist views in medieval Europe, and yeah, it does seem to be the case that most people who are accused of that weren't, right, like not just that they, you know, not just that like paranoia or whatever that that people who, you know, were completely godly people were accused of that, but also that there wasn't a lot of distinction made between, you know, not believing in God and just being like a horrible scoundrel.
Yeah,
And
there was lots of people who didn't give a shit about religion. But if you
right,
ask them, like, was Jesus Christ born and died and resurrected? They'd be like, yeah, I mean, it says in the only book I own, so why not?
yeah, yeah. I mean, so that one of the comparisons that Ryrie uses in that video, and you know, all of his lectures are really interesting. I actually, I'm curious about his own views. They're a little hard to infer from some of this, but you know, like he has a lot of, you know, but he does a bunch of videos about the kind of history of religion that are all interesting to watch. And you know, one of the things he points out is that the sort of valence of being an actual atheist in this era, right? I mean, the few people who may have actually found their way to that position was kind of the opposite of what it's been since, right? Because like if you're, you know, if you're an atheist in medieval Europe, you're somebody who thinks that like everything, basically everything that everybody who's ever read a book tells you is wrong, right?
Yeah,
So
like
like,
the only really real major educational institution in your country is
yeah,
completely wrong about everything.
yeah, exactly, right. So he sort of says it's like the equivalent of like somebody you like meet at a bar who thinks that like, is the Earth really going around the sun? I mean, like, sure doesn't seem to be moving to me.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
been like, everything that they produce in universities is wrong. It's the equivalent of that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So terribly little atheism, almost no atheism, and yet extremely unsafe streets. Um, Sweden today, tons of atheism, aside from the, you know, inebriation law. Seems like a fair amount of liberty, and also and also, you know, a good amount of public order. You know, people are. I think actually the just because I was looking these numbers up, I obviously didn't include most of this, but I think they must have slightly less strict gun laws than the UK because there are the rate of like gun homicides is higher in Sweden than the UK, but like the overall rate of homicides is much lower, and
It's
it's certainly
also a lot to do with Balkan immigrants
okay.
who kind of run. There's lots of Balkan immigrants from Balkan refugees in Sweden, and Balkan. I mean, for obvious reasons, Yugoslavs run like the gun networks of Europe, and also Swedish military bases used to be ridiculously easy to steal from.
Okay,
Um, Swedish outlaw biker gangs would just steal. They like stole like a ground to air anti aircraft missile and launched it at like another group's clubhouse. Where obviously because it was anti aircraft missile, I didn't really. I mean, obviously it was like a big physical thing, but the payload is like 5 kilograms. Um, so it didn't kill anyone. I think, or maybe it killed one person. But yeah, Sweden's.
okay. All right. Well, I now really want to see the Swedish reboot of Sons of Anarchy. That sounds like a great show, but um, but yeah, I think
You're
that's
just thrown by that.
that's awesome. I love that.
I was googling Nordic biker war, so I can send it to you.
All right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. So it doesn't really seem like there's much of an obvious connection, and you know, in fact, um, you know, there's also, you know, one of the funniest things that happened in this debate was the point where they're arguing about whether like certain kinds of acts of interpersonal violence, would have been just like unthinkable when they were growing up, which is what Peter thinks, or whether they're the sorts of things that probably always happen, which is what Christopher has suggested, and it ends up getting very personal. That Christopher says, look, it's not like when we grew up, our parents would have told us just go out, anywhere you like, and Portsmouth at night, go to the train station, docks, whatever, it's fine.
But then Peter makes the point that actually our parents would only be worried about class contagion in that case.
Yeah, exactly. He was like, yeah, I remember them warning us against like the rough boys or whatever, but I'm pretty sure those boys didn't actually pose that much danger. I think the main danger was that mom was afraid that we'd pick up their accents. So that said, as funny as that is, I did also look this up, and the actual crime rate in Britain had been declining for like a couple decades by the time they had this debate, even as presumably the rate of godlessness was continuing to go up. There's just as it generally has, and the late 20th century. And early 21st century, and as people like Peter's brother were doing their best to help it along, which would suggest that these things really don't have much to do with each other, and as indeed is the fact that the people who think the most about there not being a god are really very unlikely to engage in a lot of street violence. Um,
I
you
think it's
know,
actually a really incredibly interesting social phenomenon that if you look at real wages, we haven't got anywhere since the 1980s.
uh,
Um, the real wages of American workers are, I think, just slightly below in real dollar terms what they were in 1980. Men have seen like a large real decline, while women have seen a large real increase. But across the proletariat, it basically evens out. While at the same time, we've seen a massive decline in crime. I think it's this absolutely fascinating social phenomenon going on in the West, where crime is continuing to drop and drop and drop, despite the fact that we aren't getting richer, we aren't becoming more prosperous. But a conversation about this isn't really possible because everyone is convinced at all times that crime is getting worse, right?
yeah, right. And yeah, I think it is an interesting question why it's dropped in that period. I think there might be like a few plausible explanations that
I assume a
include.
lot of it is to do with the fact that you can't. It's really hard to do organized crime anymore unless you're in like a deep ghetto.
Right, yeah. So I think certainly, certainly, like just the proliferation of cameras has made certain kinds of crime much more difficult. And I do also think that we've gotten much better over time at detecting organized crime. I think that's right. It's it's also so I think that's definitely part of it. I also think there are like certain kinds of petty crime that might have like literally just declined because like people have more entertainment options. As silly as that sounds, right? I think that might actually be true.
Too
I
busy
don't know.
gaming to throw stones through people's windows.
Yeah, exactly. Be the opposite. Like maybe the truth is actually the opposite of that classic Simpsons episode where Marge does her crusade against violence on television, and she convinces um, the company that does Itchy and Scratchy to take out all the violence. And now that it's boring, all the kids stop watching. And there's this scene where they all flow out into the street and they're flying kites and playing in the sunshine and everything's wonderful. It's like, no, maybe it's the opposite. That's like, this is what's keeping the rock throwers
Yeah, yeah.
preoccupied at home. But yeah, I think it's also that said, right? While there has been that general trend, which definitely does go to how multi-causal this stuff is, it is also the case that I think economic conditions do still tell us a lot about country by country comparative crime statistics. That the U.S. murder rate it's not as bad as it was a few decades ago, for sure, right? But it's also pretty horrifying compared to like most developed countries. That it's really unusually high by global standards, and I think that does have a lot to do with with economic conditions, and I think there's even statistical evidence that there's quite a bit of that there is at least some effect to even pretty incremental um, economic changes like minimum wage increases, jobs programs, earned income tax credit. It's even things like this do actually seem to have a statistically noticeable, effect. And I think really jobs more than anything. So like I think that those. I think that and again, I think that when Peter says, and it makes for good rhetoric, but if you actually think about it, when Peter says things like, "Oh well, these people who are engaged in these like uh, grisly acts of violence that he's using as anecdotes. That these are, I like to call them practical atheists because they probably don't know the word atheist, but they're acting, they're like they clearly, don't, clearly don't believe, have any constraint, from Christian religion. It's like okay, but let's really think about the practical atheists and the atheists, right? Because it's like clearly your fancy intellectual atheists are not, in fact, to use Peter's favorite example, kicking people's heads in over petty arguments. That they're not doing that. Why not? Right? Well, it seems to be the case that interpersonal violence of all kinds is correlated with economic conditions that people that pretty much every kind of interpersonal violence happens more among people who are living in worse economic conditions. And there's a complicated argument to be had about why that is. In some cases it's obvious, right? Like people are gonna people are a lot more likely to join gangs in the areas with lots of poverty and unemployment, and that's not a mystery to anybody, right? In other cases, there's a more interesting question about how about like how the causation works out. But I think that the fact of it is pretty clear on its face, and I think once you really internalize that, once you start looking at the country by country statistics about atheism and crime, it just this idea that there is that people will start acting as if they're liberated from moral constraints once they become atheists. I think just doesn't really pan out as an empirical prediction, right? Like, and none of this is to say that like I don't think that there's any connection between these things empirically. I think there might be. I think that there are. In fact, I talk about this in my book about Hitchens. I think that there's certain kinds of moral heroism that I think you might be more likely to engage in if you're religious. That that like not because of any sort of conceptual connection between God and morality, but just because maybe as a psychological fact, if you sort of associate your moral feelings with this sense of transcendence in the numinous, this might actually help inspire people to certain kinds of supererogatory acts, like going above and beyond the call, whether it's like, oh, I'm gonna adopt a bunch of orphans from Ukraine, or I don't know, that you're like the sorts of acts of moral heroism you might get when you're like resisting the Nazis or something like that, right? That you might get a higher rate of those things. Now, what somebody like
Yeah, but
Christopher
Catholic priests really peaked during the Holocaust. It's been downhill since then.
and even there, notoriously mixed bag.
Mixed bag.
Yes, like you definitely had some Catholic priests who were like heroically anti-Nazi, but you also had an awful lot who, said their mass, and started with the legally required prayer for the Führer, and did exactly what they were supposed to do the entire
I mean,
time.
the argument that I was hoping Peter would make, which is at least interesting, would be this kind of like meta historical one that the very first institutions of civilization, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah,
were grain stores, which were temples, and temples, which were grain stores. And then since then, in ancient civilizations, it was normal for the leader of these states to either be the head of the cult or to be proclaimed divine themselves. Catholic Europe, Catholic medieval Europe was obviously centered around the Catholic Church, and then into modernity, what mostly happened outside of France was the monarch and the head of the state and the head of the religion became identical. And so you had this thousands and thousands of years of human civilization where the state or civilization, what you want to call it, was deeply, deeply embedded with God and with religion. And what we have now in the past couple of hundred years, where this is starting to fray, though obviously, I live in a country where the Queen,
uh,
oh, the King, sorry, is
yes.
the head of the church. Though obviously, in the reality, it's not doesn't really mean anything. Um,
Although
so
that's gotta feel like, I mean, if you're like a really devout Anglican, it's like that guy is the head of your church. I mean, that's
I mean,
gotta
I really love how formally reactionary the British Constitution is. There's only
yeah.
two states in the world where bishops sit in the upper house, and one of them is the UK.
What's the other one?
I can't remember. People always think it's Iran, but I think it isn't Iran. At least in Iran, in the upper house, it's like the upper house is elected in Iran,
Yeah, I
but
also
I think
don't
it's
know what the
formed. I
shit
think it's formed
equivalent
of
of.
religious clerics, but it's
Yeah.
elected, so it doesn't really count. I think it's the country that used to be called Swaziland.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't really know what the Shiite equivalent would be of a bishop anyway, but
Oh yeah, and they don't really have that kind of structure anyway. So, but yeah, they
yeah,
have a religious upper parliament, but it's elected from a selected list.
yeah, uh,
It's not like the UK where bishops are guaranteed seats in the House of Lords.
yeah. That's amazing.
But yeah, the argument I'd hope Peter would have made was we have this immense history of civilization, then we have this civilization which is now, and obviously lots of things have gone wrong in the past couple centuries. Um, we've been threatened with the end of civilization from nuclear war and so on. Hasn't happened, and we've become very prosperous. But there is this kind of question of like, well, it hasn't been going for very long. If we can call ourselves now atheists,
Right.
then we don't really know what can happen in the future. But instead, he made pretty shit arguments, which seemed to constantly contradict himself. Like starting from
Yeah.
the Somalia thing seemed
Yeah. Right.
like he
Because
should have been like Russia in the '90s or something. At least then you could
yeah,
vaguely connect it to atheism.
yeah. Which is, and to be fair, I mean, I think he did also bring up Russia. He started in Somalia, which is the more dramatic example. So he's describing, being a journalist in Somalia just before George Bush Sr. sent in the Marines in the early '90s, and it really is like a post-apocalyptic science fiction movie. He paints a very vivid and horrible picture of what that was like. That you're, uh, met at the airport by a bunch of, that there's like, by a bunch of guys in AK-47 with AK-47s, and they asked if you want to hire a bodyguard, and the guy from the Associated Press says, "Yeah, you better, or you're gonna die." And like drive around in cars that have been like stripped of all the upholstery, and like people, and everything's on fire, and if they didn't find just the right place to spend the night, they would have probably died, etc. And then he, a couple weeks after coming back to Britain, he sees this picture of Mogadishu from 20 years earlier, where it's like this very pleasant street that, like the exact street he was just on, where, lined with shops and, people driving by in expensive cars and all this stuff. And his point is, okay, see, civilization can be here and then go away. which is fair enough. But of course, sure doesn't have anything to do with God, because as Christopher and I think the guy from The Economist both pointed out at the Pew Forum, look, Somalia's got a million problems, but lack of religious belief is not one of them, right? Like, this is, go, take a glance at one of the State Department, reports on, the state of freedom of religion in Somalia, and it's not great.
Yeah,
Um,
we've got lots of guns, lots of God, and lots of kids.
yeah, yeah. That's neither the central government, to the extent that that controls stuff, nor the alternatives are, particularly atheistic. So that's, and Peter sort of grants the point, right? He says, look, this is, and I'm not saying that that's what happened in Somalia. I'm just saying civilization can go away. And you're right, Russia would have been a better example. He does bring up Russia later, and of course his book The Rage Against God, which I've actually read. It's an interesting book. It's very strange, but it's interesting and very well written. He talks a lot about Russia there for the same point. And yeah, there you can at least say, hey, you had several decades of official atheism, so you can blame that to some extent for the woes of this society. Although even there, right, it's like, well, I mean, seems like,
I mean, 1992 wasn't the atheists winning, was it? They lost.
yeah, exactly. Well, and in fact, as he doesn't directly connect it to Peter's point, but as Christopher does point out elsewhere in the debate, it's one of a couple things that made this feel sort of freakishly contemporary, even though this is 14 years ago. That Russia today, right? That Putin is very closely allied with the Russian Orthodox Church, and derives like a certain amount of legitimacy, from that association, and like famously gives them things they want, like anti-gay laws, and yeah. If I were an anarcho-capitalist, Somalia might not be a country I'd be eager to bring up. But in any case, that's the other thing that made it feel very, very contemporary was that so Christopher has a point where he's like, look, let's think about the link between how we want our civilization to develop and religion. And he says, imagine that you heard that there was a opposition leader in Iran who had lots of support for the population, who said he didn't believe in the coming to the 12th Imam, and that sounded like a fairy tale to him. Wouldn't you be happy to hear that? Or then he said, or imagine that Bibi Netanyahu, on one of his regular trips to the United States to humiliate our president, like announced that he was severing his coalition with Rabbi Obadiah. I feel like I'm getting that slightly wrong. Yosef, who's this super crazy Israeli rabbi who is the head of the religious part of Netanyahu's coalition at that point, who would do things like pray for God to like send a plague to smite the Palestinians. And it's like, yeah, if this man was no longer going to be part of the government, wouldn't you be happy about that? Which I think is all kind of fair enough as far as it goes. These examples do all sound like they would be good news, all else being equal. But I think that
It feels like on the Iran one, at least, that Hitchens, that Peter could just bite the bullet and go
yeah,
like, I don't think that would actually go very well, actually.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, and certainly, like, all of these are examples about people who draw horrific reactionary conclusions from religious belief and how that's bad. And that's true. But the problem is that there are also people who draw the opposite conclusion from their religious beliefs. That there are nuns who pour blood on nuclear weapons silos. That there are those priests who resisted Hitler. There's that John Brown thought God wanted him to go fight the slavers in Kansas.
I wanted him to decapitate white boys.
Eh, well, depends on the white boy in particular, and what they've done. I'm critical support for John Brown, but like,
Uncritical support for John Brown.
but there are rabbis who go to who lead peace protests and whatever. So like, so there's no guarantee there, and like frankly, religious people in that second category, I greatly prefer to the politics of many people who agree with me and Christopher about metaphysics, right? Like this, that in the book I mentioned, sort of examples about, people, for example, like most
We were talking about
libertarian.
it last week, right? Like about Dawkins or whatever switching sides in the culture war.
Yeah, totally. Right. And or like, yeah, most libertarians seem to be atheists. That's, certainly if you're like an Ayn Rand acolyte, that's like a very important part of your worldview
Yeah,
is
I mean there are Randian Christians, right, aren't there? But it's such a disgusting idea.
I don't understand how that works.
I mean, it can't really if you had to think about it. Like, you
Yeah,
can't
because
think Christ is king and think you're like a sovereign, whatever.
because it does seem to me that whatever else you can say one way or the other about Christianity, Jesus is pretty clear that you're also supposed to give a shit about other people.
But like Rand Paul isn't called that by accident, is he?
Yeah, it was, yeah, right. Ron Paul probably named him after Ayn Rand. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure there are people who in fact, I know there are people who are devout Christians who like Ayn Rand just because she was so anti-communist. But how much time they've actually spent thinking about how to piece together those worldviews, it would be interesting to know, right? I'd be very, very curious about that. But yeah, like, so yeah, they've got a line in the book about, atheist libertarians who, whose idea of utopia would be a society where people are, there's a free market for people to sell their organs for Bitcoin so they can make rent, and feed their families. And atheist neoconservatives who want to bring secular liberalism to Iran with the 82nd Airborne. And yeah, I mean, given the choice, I would vastly prefer the kind of religious people who think that God wants them to stop wars and help poor people than atheists of that type, right? I mean, there's just no, I mean, I guess maybe we could try to do some sort of utilitarian calculation for like how many people will break which way if everybody stops believing in God. But I, for one, would have absolutely no idea how to even start doing that calculation, which is why I'm actually not particularly confident that about Christopher's implied argument that good and benevolent political consequences will come about from everybody having the right metaphysical beliefs. They might not, right? Like, I don't know. I
This
think
this
that
is this is boring centrist philosopher talk. Ben, we need extremist positions. We're on YouTube.
oh yeah, no, look, we everything would be fine if people just stopped believing in this fucking stupid Sky Daddy.
Linear time doesn't exist. You need a two box.
Also, there's no linear time in two boxes. Two boxes is the correct view about Newcomb's paradox, and I can't believe you retards don't see that. Yeah, all right, there we go. I've done my 45 seconds as an epic based
Clip
YouTube
that. Clip that.
of, and honestly, I would I was joking, but I still feel a little gross for having said all that. So it genuinely leaves a bad taste in my mouth. But yeah, like I don't think there's any guarantee that people come to the right, that like people will come to the right political conclusions if they get the metaphysics right. I think that um
Well, I mean, Christopher Hitchens didn't.
yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Right. And so, to my mind, I mean, the reason to, the reason to be an atheist is just because, the evidence would strongly suggest that it's correct. And I would like to have correct beliefs, right? I'm curious about the world around me, and I want to, and to the extent that's possible, I want my beliefs about it to correspond to reality. Um, and so I don't find all of that very compelling. But then the idea that empirically, people are going to stop believing in God and start believing that everything is permitted, and settle all arguments with head kicking, does just doesn't seem to line up with the available evidence either. So it seems like once you abandon that, what's left of Peter's argument is that, well, without God, sure, empirically it might be the case that people keep on believing in morality, but uh, maybe it'll be like irrational for them to do so, that they'll no longer their moral beliefs will no longer be coherent. There's no magnetic
I mean, yeah, I
force.
mean, atheism does open the possibility that moral realism is wrong, but maybe moral realism is wrong.
Yeah, and so maybe Peter's idea is that people will, maybe the charitable construction is that you know when theism falls, so too does moral realism, and that even if it's going to take people a few more generations to figure it out, they'll eventually figure this out, and then we'll have everybody will be stark naked running through the streets, killing each other. Um, and I don't particularly buy that one either, because whereas moral realism might or might not be correct, big, big issue, right? Very hard to settle. Uh, it's also not one that I think the idea that moral realism rises or falls with theism just doesn't really survive close examination. That whether, I mean, it's a giant and interesting question whether there's any sense in which you could be objectively right or wrong about morality, what exactly it would mean to be objectively, right or wrong about this. Is this ultimately just a claim about language, that our moral terms, latch on to certain things, and so you're like using them wrong if you use them in this, if you use them in some other way than like the whatever way is objectively correct. That doesn't really seem to tell us much by itself about moral motivation. I'm not going to make any attempt to solve all of metaethics in the next 90 seconds. But
But in the last 90 seconds, someone is being transphobic and saying I'm stealing valor.
oh, okay. Sure. Minecraft Girls is. So I believe that account is operated by all the girls on Minecraft.
That's pretty
Uh,
cool.
yeah,
Ben, what's
they,
on
they, they
the
all,
topic?
they, they all got together. Well, just real quick before we do that, right? Like, um, the reason I don't think that moral realism rises or falls with theism, that whatever's true about moral realism, like whatever difficult philosophical questions there are about making sense of moral realism, adding the assumption that God exists to your premise is going to do nothing to solve them. That it's going to that like that just going to be an irrelevance. It's not going to help. And the reason that I think so is because Plato, I think is very convincing on this point. That this is the Euthyphro argument. So basically, translate into the terms that we're talking about. If you think that if you think that the morally right is that which God commands, then does God command it because it's morally right, or is it morally right because it commands it? If God commands it because it's morally right, then there must be some other reason why it's morally right besides God commanding it. If God command, if it's only morally right because God commands it, then if God decided tomorrow that, go forth and murder all the Minecraft girls was his will, then that would become morally right, right? So it ends up becoming this essentially parody of moral relativism, and this is, I think there are moves that people make to try to get around this, but none of them are very convincing. Like, oh well, maybe it's not God's commands, maybe it's like morality is defined by like the fixed moral character of God, right? This is the sort of thing people say, but then that just pushes the question back a step, right? Like, well, if God has a certain moral character, why is that a good moral character to have? Is it just it's the one that God happens to have, or does God have that one because he's essentially good or whatever, right? Like, I think that you just get a version of the same problem, and I find it incredibly frustrating that for all of the virtues of both of these guys, that got both of them got lots of stuff wrong. Peter continues to get lots of stuff wrong, uh, but um, but they're both in many ways extremely interesting and
I mean, you'd
articulate.
rather them 1,000 times than Destiny or Ben Shapiro or whatever.
Exactly, right. Totally. Uh, so yeah, normally I really enjoy reading, watching, listening to these guys, whatever I disagree with them about. But man, uh, if you're going to be a defender of Western civilization, at some point you should get around to reading Plato.
Do you remember that time when Ben Shapiro went on British TV with our like most right wing commentator, and he called him a
Andrew Neil,
leftist?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
very different cultures,
stormed away from the interview because he was clearly a biased lib.
separated by a common language, as they say,
Yeah, no, that
like
was
headbangers.
no, that was a absolutely amazing moment. That I just yes, I enjoyed that so much. And yeah, this is not, I don't know. I just right now the American right wing is not sending their best, and so we just need to shut this down until we figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I
But
mean, it might be a thing of just, you don't want to say this about your apparent enemies, but it might be just the fact that they don't really have any good arguments. And thus, there isn't really a possibility for them to be intellectualized because as soon as you get intellectualized, you're like, oh, it doesn't make any sense.
yeah, I mean, it is really striking that all of the smartest right wingers, in some way or another, deviate from like the
Yeah, they
standard
become
like
very heterodox.
admixture of things that
They
that
either go full mental or they go like, they try to be slightly serious about populism.
yeah, exactly, right. They either get a little serious about populism, your Amaris and Danines, they or they're at least somewhat consistent libertarians, so they end up abandoning a bunch of standard right wing views there, or yeah, maybe they just become like uh completely insane opponents of modernity, but at least interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
And
I'm sure if you kind of tried to distill American liberalism down into a coherent set of beliefs, you'd have an incredible mess.
yeah, um, I mean, I certainly don't doubt that, but yeah, um, owning the libs. We'll wait for another week.
I just wrote about Gnosticism.
Yeah, I still need to do Gnosticism. Not next week though. Next week I am going to. Um, I'm going to write basically a follow up to that Jacobin article that everybody got mad about. And because it actually seems to me that there's an interesting philosophical issue that I wasn't even thinking about when I wrote it. but I think a lot of the subsequent discussion brought out, which is that a lot of people who I'm just trying to come up with a nice neutral way to describe them. Let's say a lot of people who use the word decolonize a lot, right? A lot of those people um, have, in effect, without realizing it, a very libertarian way of thinking
Mm.
about justice, right? That if you, that I think a very basic difference between leftists and libertarians is about whether justice is about process, right? That in other words, that you haven't done certain kinds of bad things to people, or if you have, you've reversed it and undone the bad things and taken us back to some point in the past where you had a more just distribution, or whether it's about creating a more equal society going forward. And I think that a lot of these people have interestingly found themselves on the wrong side of that line, and it's interesting to kind of reflect on what that distinction is and why it matters.
Sorry, I was just noticing that my microphone was just picking up, I don't know, my fan noise or something there. But yeah.
Oh, I'm
But
not here.
you're not actually going to be here next week.
No, I'm not going to be here next week, but we could talk about it the week after. Uh,
It's a shame, yeah, because I mean, I'm very interested in this whole indigeneity stuff and whatever.
no, we
Maybe
will we'll
we'll get
get
there in
we'll
a
get
moment.
into it. I was assuming, yeah. I mean, we're actually talking about the essay that was written this week, because like just out of this week and last week, that this is the one that you decided would be more interesting to talk about. But we can go back to being a week behind when we see each other in 2 weeks. Um, do you think you're gonna do something on your own next Sunday, or are you gonna? Okay.
I may as well try. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
last
yeah.
Monday went well, so
Nice.
the only
Yep.
problem is it takes up my evenings to do stuff. But I'll have to think of something, I guess, tomorrow because I haven't got one yet.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Exactly. From the lamp ready for. I think that there's a lot of. I think that there's a lot of de facto Nozikianism in the decolonization crowd. But in any case, so we will get into that when we see each other in 2 weeks. And meanwhile, everybody can look forward to whatever Stefan is talking about uh, next week. I don't know. This the maybe you can bring on all the Minecraft girls to for a stimulating debate about whatever they're mad at you about.
All right, everyone. Bye.
Bye.